In the neon-soaked shadows of Seoul, he was more than a man, a ghost story told to keep rivals in line. She was just a waitress who splashed a $5,000 cocktail across his tailored suit. So when he smirked and said, "Sing Puccini perfectly right now, and I'll marry you. Fail and you'll find out why they call me the butcher," he thought it was a sadistic game. He didn't know he had just challenged a hidden masterpiece disguised as a servant. Inside the smoke-filled air of the Gilded Lotus, where the city's most dangerous bloodlines came to play, Rim-hun was expecting total submission. Instead, the universe gave him Andrea J. Blank, an elegant woman in a crisp white bow tie, a shattered glass of forbidden luxury, and an impossible ultimatum that would rewrite the laws of the Seoul underworld. What started as a cruel death sentence turned into a high note that paralyzed the room, and sparked a lethal alliance that neither of them would survive alone. The Gilded Lotus didn't breathe, it pulsed. It was a cathedral of neon and chrome, where the air smelled of expensive tobacco and the kind of perfume that cost a month's rent. Andrea moved through the haze like a shadow in silk, her spine a rigid line of practiced invisibility. In her crisp white shirt and black bow tie, she was part of the furniture, a vessel for pouring vintage scotch and clearing the debris of men who decided the fate of the city over Wagyu beef. At the center of the storm sat Table 1. Rim-hun didn't look like a butcher. He looked like a masterpiece of modern architecture, sharp, cold, and devastatingly intentional. His dark hair was slicked back, catching the amber glow of the overhead lights, and a leather-strap watch hugged a wrist where the dark ink of a tattoo peeked from beneath a tailored cuff. He leaned back, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he watched a rival grovel. Andrea approached to refresh the table, her hands steady, her mind miles away in a Juilliard practice room she hadn't stepped inside for 3 years. Then, the world glitched. A drunken associate bumped her elbow. Time slowed as the tray tilted. The Lotus's kiss, a vibrant, hibiscus-infused cocktail, arced through the air like a spray of arterial blood. It landed squarely on Hyun's lap, blooming across his light gray trousers in a jagged, mocking stain. The music didn't stop, but the soul of the room died. The clinking of silverware vanished. The floor manager turned ashen, already calculating the cost of a body bag. Andrea didn't scream, she didn't beg. She simply stood there, a silver tray clutched to her chest, her dark eyes meeting Hyun's freezing gaze. She saw the lethal flicker in his expression, the casual way his tattooed hand came up to rest under his chin. "Do you have any idea?" Hyun whispered, his voice a velvet blade that cut through the silence. "What this suit is worth?" "More than my life, I imagine," Andrea replied, her voice low and remarkably clear. Hyun's smirk deepened. The defiance in her tone was a novelty. He glanced at the empty stage where a bored jazz trio had been performing. A cruel light sparked in his eyes. "The Gilded Lotus is supposed to be a place of culture, yet I find myself bored and damp," he said, standing slowly. He towered over her, the scent of sandalwood and danger rolling off him in waves. "I hear you foreign girls come to Seoul with big dreams, so let's make a wager, waitress." He gestured to the microphone. "Sing Puccini, un bel di vedremo. If you can perform it perfectly, if you can make me forget I'm wearing a ruined suit, I'll marry you. I'll give you the world." The room erupted in hushed, jagged whispers. It was a death sentence disguised as a joke. "And if I fail?" Andrea asked. Hyun stepped closer, leaning into her space until she could see the gold flecks in his predatory eyes. "If you fail, you'll find out exactly why they call me the butcher. You won't just leave this club, you'll disappear from this earth." Andrea looked at the stage. She thought of her sister, lost in the cracks of this city. She thought of the voice she had buried under layers of grief. She walked toward the microphone, the heels of her shoes clicking like a countdown on the polished floor. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a weapon being unsheathed. The silence in the Gilded Lotus was no longer empty. It was heavy, a suffocating vacuum that pressed against Andrea's lungs as she stood before the microphone. Below the stage, Rim-hyun watched with the detached interest of a man observing a butterfly before pinning it to a board. He adjusted his leather-strap watch, the subtle smirk never leaving his face, waiting for the inevitable crack in her composure. Andrea closed her eyes. The scent of spilled hibiscus and expensive tobacco faded, replaced by the ghost of a candlelit stage in New York. She reached deep into the hollow space where she had hidden her grief and found the first note. When she opened her mouth, it wasn't a waitress who spoke. It was a storm. The opening of Un bel diadremo floated through the lounge, a crystalline thread of sound so pure it seemed to physically push back the shadows. Andrea's voice, rich, resonant, and aching with the technical precision of her Juilliard years, bloomed into the room. She sang of longing and the horizon, her voice climbing the staff with effortless grace. The hardened men at the surrounding tables, men who traded in misery and silence, found themselves leaning forward. Glasses remained mid-air. Cigarettes burned down to the filter, forgotten. Ian's smirk didn't just fade, it vanished. His tattooed hand dropped from his chin as he sat bolt upright, his dark eyes widening as the black waitress transformed. She was no longer a servant in a stained shirt. She was a Valkyrie, her sleek low bun and crisp bow tie lending her the air of a high priestess conducting a ritual. As she hit the final, soaring crescendo, a note so sharp and clear it vibrated through the very crystal she had shattered minutes before, the room remained paralyzed. The echo died away, leaving a ringing void. Andrea stood trembling, her breath hitching in her chest. The mask of the diva slipped, and the fear of the butcher rushed back in. She looked down at Hyun, expecting the signal for her removal. Instead, Rim-hyun began to clap. Slow, deliberate. The sound sparked the rest of the room into a frenzy of hushed, frantic whispers. Hyun stood, his presence commanding the space as he walked toward the stage. He climbed the steps, stopping inches from her. The cinematic warmth of the stage lights caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a god of the underworld. I expected a desperate plea, Hyun said, his voice low enough only for her to hear. I didn't expect a weapon. Andrea didn't flinch. I met your challenge, Mr. Rim. My life is mine again. No, Hyun countered, his eyes burning with a sudden, calculating fire. Your life as a waitress ended the moment you hit that high B. I am a man of my word, Andrea. I said if you sang perfectly, I would marry you. He turned to the room, his voice projecting with chilling authority. This woman is no longer on staff. As of tonight, she is my fiancée. Anyone who looks at her, looks at me. Anyone who touches her, answers to the butcher. He turned back to her, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear. You want your sister, don't you? Then play your part. Sign the contract, and I'll tear this city apart to find her. Refuse me, and you're back in the gutter. Andrea looked at his offered hand, the hand of a killer, draped in luxury. She took it, her fingers disappearing into his. The deal was struck in the key of Puccini, and the war for soul had just found its melody. The heavy glass doors of the Gilded Lotus swung shut, cutting off the frantic whispers of the underworld. Outside, Seoul was a blur of neon reflections and a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the pavement into a black mirror. A sleek, charcoal-toned sedan idled at the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum. Rim-hyun didn't wait for his security detail. He gripped Andrea's elbow. Not with the roughness of a captor, but with the firm, possessive intent of a man claiming a prize, and guided her into the plush leather interior of the back seat. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud, plunging them into a world of silence, expensive cologne, and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. Hyun sat back, the shadows of the passing streetlights dancing across the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look at her immediately. He produced a silver case, lighting a cigarette with a steady hand. The cherry glow illuminated the intricate black ink crawling up his knuckles. You have a gift, Andrea, he said, the smoke curling around his head like a shroud. But gifts are liabilities in this city if they aren't protected. My uncles see me as a modern threat, too young, too detached from the old ways. They want a leader who is married to tradition. I need a fiancé who can command a room of vipers without flinching. Andrea stared at her reflection in the window, her hand still trembling beneath the hem of her white shirt. You want a puppet in a bow tie, someone to smile for the cameras while you consolidate your power. I want a partner who can play the part of a queen, Hyun corrected, turning his head to fix her with a gaze that was disturbingly observant. In exchange, you receive the full protection of the Rim Syndicate. No one touches you. No one questions you. Protection isn't enough, Andrea said, her voice regaining the steel it had found on the stage. She turned to face him, ignoring the danger radiating from his frame. You mentioned my sister. You knew who I was before I ever spilled that drink. Hun's smirk returned, faint and dangerous. I make it my business to know every ghost that haunts my establishments. Maya blank. She disappeared into the red light districts of Incheon 14 months ago. The police closed the file. My people, however, don't close files until I tell them to. Andrea felt a sharp physical ache in her chest at the mention of Maya's name. If I play this game, if I wear your ring and stand by your side, you find her. Not just a lead, not a maybe. You bring her back to me. I will put every resource I have into locating her, Hyun said, leaning closer until the scent of sandalwood and rain was overwhelming. But understand the stakes, Andrea. This isn't a performance you can walk away from after the final curtain. You will live in my home. You will learn the names of my enemies. To the world, you will be the woman who tamed the butcher. If the lie breaks, we both bleed. The car swerved through the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam, a private island of steel in a sea of neon. Andrea looked at his tattooed hand, held out in the dim light. It was a contract signed in shadows, a marriage born of necessity and blood. Find her, she whispered, her voice a low vow. She placed her hand in his. His grip was cold, certain, and absolute. The deal was done, and as the car sped into the heart of the city, Andrea realized she hadn't just saved her life, she had traded it for a chance to win a war. The penthouse atop the rim tower was a fortress of glass and cold, white marble, looking down on the glittering veins of Seoul like a god from a distance. The silence here was different from the car. It was heavier, saturated with the quiet hum of high-end security systems and the scent of expensive cedar. Andrea stood in the center of the living area, her silhouette reflected against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She still wore the waitress uniform, the white shirt now wrinkled, the black bow tie hanging loose around her neck. She felt like an antique misplaced in a showroom of the future. The guest suite is to the left, Hyun said, his voice echoing off the hard surfaces. He was moving toward a wet bar, shedding his ruined suit jacket as he went. He tossed the $5,000 garment onto a designer chair with a carelessness that made Andrea flinch. As he turned to pour himself a drink, he began unbuttoning his shirt. Andrea meant to look away, but the movement caught her eye. As the silk fabric fell open, the butcher was finally revealed. The tattoos weren't just on his wrists. They were a landscape. A sprawling, intricate masterpiece of Irizumi ink covered his chest and shoulders, bleeding down his ribs in a dark, chaotic tide. It wasn't the decorative art of a hobbyist. It was the ledger of a life lived in violence. Traditional Korean dragons coiled around his collarbones, their scales rendered in such fine detail they seemed to shimmer in the low light. Intertwined with the mythical beasts were scenes of turbulent waves and jagged mountain peaks, all rendered in shades of deep charcoal and blood red. But it was the scars beneath the ink that told the real story. Faint, jagged lines intersected the dragons' bodies, reminders of blades and bullets that the tattoos could only partially hide. Hyun caught her staring. He didn't cover himself. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, the amber liquid catching the light. Every line has a price, Andre, he said. His voice devoid of its usual my world. You don't wear your history on your sleeve. You wear it where it can't be washed off. He walked toward her, the half-open shirt fluttering with his movement. As he stopped in front of her, she could see the tattoo of a lotus flower over his heart, trapped in the talons of a hawk. My uncles think these markings make me a relic, he whispered, leaning down so his eyes were level with hers. They think I'm just a dog on a leash, decorated for show. They don't realize that the ink is what keeps the monster inside quiet. Andrea reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink on his chest. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, a stark contrast to the chilled air of the penthouse. This wasn't just a contract marriage anymore. Seeing the map of his pain laid bare made the danger tactile. She wasn't just entering a palace. She was stepping into a cage with a man who had survived 1,000 deaths. You're afraid, Hyun noted, his gaze tracking the slight tremor in her hand. I'm awake, Andrea replied, pulling her hand back and meeting his stare. I finally see exactly what kind of devil I've made a deal with. Hyun's smirk returned, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. Good, If you're going to survive the rims, you need to stop looking for a savior and start looking for a shadow. Go to sleep, Andrea. Tomorrow, the performance truly begins. The following morning, the penthouse was transformed into a classroom of high-stakes deception. The cold marble surfaces were covered not with books, but with dossiers, surveillance photos, and family trees that mapped out the rot within the Rim Empire. Hien stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the morning sun, now dressed in a fresh black suit that concealed the ink they had shared in the shadows of the night before. In the underworld, names are currency, but relationships are the vault, Hien said, his voice devoid of its predatory edge, replaced by a clinical coldness. He tapped a photo of a man with silver hair and a face like etched granite. Elder Rim, my uncle. He values 3 things: lineage, silence, and the illusion of control. He will look at you and see a variable he didn't calculate. Your job isn't just to be my fiancé, it is to be the piece that makes his entire strategy irrelevant. For hours, he drilled her on the intricacies of the syndicate, who was indebted to whom, which council members were susceptible to flattery, and which ones only understood the language of a threat. He taught her the Mafia smirk, the art of looking at a murderer and making them feel like the prey. You move too much, he criticized, his hand steadying her shoulder. A queen doesn't seek attention, the room recalibrates to find her. Minimal movement, absolute presence. Andrea absorbed it all with the discipline of a scholar, but as the sun began to dip, she set the dossiers aside. The silence of the penthouse felt hollow, a vacuum of power that lacked a heartbeat. You've taught me how to survive them, Hien, she said, walking toward the grand piano that sat like a silent beast in the corner of the room. But you're missing the most important lesson. You have the power, but you have no soul. And without soul, you're just a man waiting for a younger version of yourself to come along and take what's yours. She sat at the bench and played a single haunting chord. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. Music isn't about hitting the notes perfectly. It's about why the notes exist. If you want to convince your uncles that we are a force they cannot break, they have to see something in us that they can't buy or intimidate. They have to see a connection that feels inevitable. Hien walked over, leaning his weight against the piano's polished lid. And how do you propose we faking inevitable? You don't fake it, Andrea whispered, her fingers beginning a soft, melodic trill. You find the resonance. Listen. She began to sing, not the soaring bravado of Puccini, but a low, soulful melody, a song of resilience that had traveled across oceans and through generations. She watched his face, seeing the mask of the butcher flicker. For a moment, the room wasn't a fortress, it was a sanctuary. Power is noise, she said as the final note lingered. But resonance is what stays when the room goes quiet. If you want to win, stop trying to be the loudest man in the room, be the one they can't stop hearing. Hien looked at her, and for the first time, the calculation in his eyes softened into something more dangerous. Genuine curiosity. The masterclass was over, but the boundaries between their roles were beginning to blur. The ancestral Rim estate was a place where modern soul went to die. Tucked away behind fortress-like stone walls, the Hanak compound smelled of damp earth and centuries of rigid etiquette. As Andrea stepped out of the car, the cool night air bit at her shoulders, but she didn't shiver. She was draped in a deep emerald silk gown that contrasted strikingly with her mahogany skin, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight and polished it looked like carved onyx. Hien offered his arm, his expression a mask of granite. This isn't a dinner, he murmured, his breath ghosting against her ear. It's a court-martial. My uncle will use the language of hospitality to see if you break. Do not let him find a seam. They were led into a sprawling dining hall where Elder Rim sat at the head of a low table, flanked by stone-faced advisors. The air was thick with the scent of fermented soy and the unsaid. Elder Rim didn't rise. He merely adjusted his traditional robes, his eyes, as sharp and cold as obsidian, scanning Andrea with a clinical disdain. Hien, the elder began, his voice a dry rasp. You bring a guest who does not know our ways to a table that demands them. It is a bold choice, or perhaps a desperate one. The dinner was a calculated gauntlet of humiliation. Course after course arrived, featuring delicacies meant to baffle an outsider. The elder spoke exclusively in a dialect of high-form Korean, thick with metaphors designed to highlight Andrea's status as a temporary visitor to their world. He spoke of weeds in a manicured garden and birds that mimic the song of their masters. Andrea sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her lap, just as Hyun had taught her. She didn't need the translation to feel the poison. When a bowl of honjeoho, pungent, fermented skate, was placed before her, the table went silent. It was a test of stomach and spirit, a dish often used to mock the uninitiated. In our culture, Elder Rim said, switching to a precise, mocking English, we believe that if one cannot handle the bitterness of our roots, they cannot hope to share in the sweetness of our future. Tell me, Miss Blank, do you find our traditions too strong for your palate? Andrea looked at the dish, then up at the elder. She didn't look to Hyun for help. She picked up her chopsticks with a grace that silenced the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She took a bite, the ammonia-like sharpness stinging her throat, but her expression didn't flicker. Strength is an acquired taste, Elder Rim, she said, her voice like velvet over steel. In my culture, we have a saying, the fire that melts the wax is the same fire that tempers the steel. You speak of roots, but roots only matter if the tree can survive the storm. I haven't just handled bitterness, I've survived it. She set her chopsticks down and leaned forward slightly, the cinematic warmth of the hearth lighting the defiance in her eyes. You wonder if I am a weed, but a weed is just a plant that thrives where it isn't wanted, and I assure you, I am very good at thriving. Hyun's hand found hers under the table, his grip a sudden, grounding heat. For the first time, Elder Rim's eyes flickered with something other than contempt. It was a sliver of recognition, the realization that he hadn't invited a waitress to dinner, but a queen who had already mastered the art of the war. The heavy silence of the car journey back from the estate was broken not by words, but by the slide of a manila envelope across the leather seat. The rain had returned, a frantic tapping against the glass that matched the sudden, erratic rhythm of Andrea's heart. My people found a ghost, Hyun said, his profile illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of passing streetlights. A girl matching Maya's description was seen 3 nights ago at a transit hub in Gurion. But she wasn't traveling, she was being moved. Andrea snatched the envelope. Inside was a grainy surveillance still. It was blurry, distorted by the night and the rain, but she would recognize that tilt of the head anywhere. It was Maya, her face pale, being ushered into the back of a nondescript van by a man whose neck was marked with the distinctive jagged scarring of a rival street gang, the shadows that operated beneath even the Rim's notice. Gurion, Andrea whispered, the name tasting like ash. It was the Moon Village, the last sprawling slum of Seoul, a labyrinth of corrugated metal and desperate dreams. It was the place she had spent everyone to escape, a world she had promised herself she would never see again. It's a black hole for my kind, Hyun said, turning to face her. The cinematic warmth of the dashboard lights caught the gold in his eyes. If I send my men in there, the alarms go off. The girl will be moved or silenced before we hit the first alleyway. To find her, we need someone who knows how to move like a shadow. Someone who looks like they belong to the mud, not the marble. You want me to go back, she said. It wasn't a question. I want you to go undercover. Tomorrow night, there is a low-level exchange happening in a basement club called The Void. The man with the scarred neck will be there. You go in, you identify the location of the holding cell, and you get out. I will be 3 blocks away with a strike team, but for 60 minutes, you will be on your own. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, lethal-looking earpiece and a burner phone. You'll have to shed the silk, Andrea. No emerald gowns, no Juilliard posture. You have to become the girl who fled the gutter again. Andrea looked at the photo of her sister. The fear that had lived in her marrow for 14 months crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. She thought of the masterclass Hyun had given her, the lessons in presence and power. But this was the opposite. This was the art of being nothing. I never truly left Gurion, Hyun, she said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register. I just put on a better costume. She reached up and pulled the pins from her sleek bun, letting her hair fall in a dark cloud around her shoulders. She unbuttoned the top of her gown, the elegance of the Mafia bride dissolving in the dark of the car. Hyun watched her, his gaze unreadable. For the first time, the butcher looked unsettled. If they realize who you are, who you belong to, they won't just kill you, they'll use you to start a war. Then don't let them realize, Andrea replied, meeting his stare with the same defiance she had shown his uncle. Just be ready when I call. Because when I find her, I'm not coming out alone. The grand debut wasn't just a gala, it was a battlefield draped in velvet and gold leaf. The International Syndicate Summit was held in a glass-domed conservatory on the edge of the Han River, a place where the air tasted of salt, power, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Leaders from every corner of the global underworld moved through the space like sharks in an aquarium, their smiles as sharp as the knives hidden in their waistbands. Andrea stood behind the heavy velvet curtain of the main stage, her reflection in a tall pier mirror unrecognizable. Gone was the girl who had waded through the mud of Guriong 48 hours prior. In her place stood a vision of lethal elegance. She wore a custom gown of midnight blue lace that clung to her like a second skin, the back plunging low to reveal the poise of a woman who had seen the abyss and refused to blink. On her finger, the rim engagement ring caught the cinematic glow of the chandeliers, a heavy weight of diamonds that felt like a shackle and a shield. The girl is safe, Hyun's voice crackled in her earpiece, low and steady. Maya is across the border, under heavy guard. Now, give them the performance that makes you untouchable. Andrea took a breath, the scent of expensive lilies filling her lungs. She looked through a slit in the curtain. At the center table, Hyun sat beside his uncle, his expression an impenetrable mask of dark-suited authority. But his eyes were scanning the perimeter. They both knew the summit was a trap. Somewhere in the shadows of the mezzanine, or behind the rows of security, an assassin was waiting for the moment her voice hit its peak to silence the Rim lineage forever. The lights dimmed to a dramatic, warm focus. Andrea stepped onto the stage, the click of her heels echoing like a heartbeat against the silence. 1,000 pairs of eyes, predatory, skeptical, and dangerous, locked onto her. She began to sing. It wasn't Puccini this time. It was O mio babbino caro. But she sang it with a dark, modern edge that stripped the song of its innocence. Her voice rippled through the conservatory, a sonic weapon that commanded the room to still. As she moved toward the edge of the stage, she saw a flicker of movement in the wings, the glint of a long-range barrel catching a stray beam of light. She didn't stop. She didn't flinch. Instead, she used her voice as a beacon, moving into the direct line of fire to draw the killer out, forcing Hyun's strike team to locate the source. She reached the crescendo, her voice soaring toward the glass dome, an ethereal sound that seemed to shatter the tension in the room. A muffled thud echoed from the rafters. Not a gunshot, but the sound of a body hitting the floor. Hyun looked up, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips as he saw his men drag a shadowed figure from the mezzanine. Andrea held the final note until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of it. When she finished, the silence wasn't the heavy vacuum of the lounge. It was the stunned reverence of an audience that realized they were looking at the true power behind the Rim throne. She looked down at Hyun, and for the first time, he didn't look at her like a contract or a weapon. He looked at her like a man who had finally found the melody to his own dark soul. The aftermath of the summit didn't smell of victory. It smelled of ozone and rain. As the glass-domed conservatory cleared of terrified dignitaries, the true battle moved to the private docks of the Han River. Elder Rim stood at the edge of the water, his traditional robes whipping in the wind, flanked by the remnants of his loyalist guards. The coup had been silent, a series of failed assassinations and intercepted messages, but the final confrontation was loud. Hyun stepped into the moonlight, his black suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink of the dragons and the scars of the survivor. Beside him, Andrea stood as his equal, the midnight blue lace of her gown stained with the salt of the river. "It's over, Uncle," Hyun said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "The international board saw the performance. They saw the stability I bring. Your tradition is just a shroud for a dying era." Elder Rim looked at Andrea, his obsidian eyes filled with a final, desperate venom. "You chose a waitress to bridge the gap. You've poisoned the lineage for a voice." She didn't bridge the gap, he encountered, stepping forward to close the distance. She closed it, and while you were busy trying to humiliate her at dinner, she was busy identifying the men you paid to move her sister. My people didn't just find Maya, Uncle. They found the ledger you used to sell her. The revelation hit the air like a physical blow. Andrea felt the world tilt. It wasn't just a rival gang, it was the rot within the family itself. The betrayal was complete. As he and security detail moved in to strip the elder of his title and his freedom, a smaller black SUV pulled into the gravel lot. The door opened and a young girl, frail but alive, stepped into the light. "Andrea?" The sound of her sister's voice was the only note that mattered. Andrea didn't run. She glided, her composure finally breaking into a sob as she pulled Maya into her arms. The weight of 14 months of silence evaporated in the cold soul air. Minutes later, as the sirens faded into the distance and the docks went quiet, Ian stood by the railing, looking out at the black water. Andrea approached him, the heavy diamond ring on her finger catching the light of the moon. "The contract is fulfilled," she said softly. "My sister is safe. Your power is absolute. I suppose this is where the performance ends." Ian turned to her. The butcher mask was gone, replaced by the man who had sat at the piano and listened to the resonance of her soul. He reached out, his tattooed thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The contract was for a fake marriage, Andrea," he whispered, his voice thick with a sincerity that no dossier could have predicted. "But there hasn't been anything fake about the way I look at you for a long time." The performance ended at the gala. This is the only real thing I have left." Andrea looked at the man who had kidnapped her, protected her, and fought a war for her family. She realized then that the fake marriage had become her sanctuary. She didn't take off the ring. Instead, she leaned into him, the singer and the shadow, finally finding their rhythm. In a city of noise and lethal politics, they had stopped acting. They had finally found their perfect harmony.